The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63. 1. How to start a war. By 1756, Europe had known 8 years of peace. But the War of the Austrian Succession had settled nothing. It had left Austria insecure in Bohemia and Italy, Prussia insecure in Silesia, Britain insecure in Hanover, France insecure in India, America, and on the Rhine. The Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748 had achieved no territorial settlement comparable in stability to that reached by the Treaty of Westphalia a century before. The old balance of power had been disturbed by the growth of the Prussian army and the British navy. That army might sally forth on new absorptions. That navy needed only time to capture the colonies of France, Holland, and Spain. The rising spirit of nationalism was fed in England by the profits and prospects of commerce, in Prussia by successful war, in France by a cultural superiority uncomfortably conscious of martial decline. The conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism had ended in a stalemate. Both sides waited for some turn of chance to renew the 30 Years' War for possession of the European soul. Austria took the initiative in preparing a new throw of the human dice. Maria Theresa, the 39 years old but still fair head of the Austrian Empire, had all the pride of her Habsburg ancestry, all the anger of a woman scorned. How could she live with Silesia amputated from her inherited realm, whose territorial integrity all the major states of Europe had guaranteed? Even the Frederick who had humiliated her would later praise her courage and ability, and the way in which, when it seemed that events were conspiring to ruin her, this younger ruler caught the spirit of government and became the soul of her council. Defeated, yielding Silesia as the price of peace, she made the peace only a truce and devoted herself to the reform of administration, the restoration of her shattered armies, and the acquisition of strong allies. Frequently she visited the camps where her troops were being trained. For this purpose she traveled to Prague in Bohemia, to Olmütz in Moravia. She inspired the soldiers with rewards and distinctions, and even more by her regal and yet womanly presence. Her generals did not have to swear fidelity to her, for this was in their blood and chivalry. So the Prince of Liechtenstein spent 200,000 écus, or about $1.5 million, of his fortune in recruiting and equipping for her a complete artillery corps. She founded near Vienna a war college for the younger nobility and brought to its staff the best teachers of geometry, geography, fortification, and history. Under her, said Frederick, the military of Austria acquired a degree of perfection never known to her predecessors, and a woman carried out designs worthy of a great man. Diplomacy was the other side of the design. She sent agents everywhere to win friends for Austria and stir up hostility to Frederick. She noted the rising strength of Russia, which had been organized by Peter the Great and was now commanded by the Tsarina Elizaveta Petrovna. She saw to it that Frederick's sarcastic remarks about the amours of the Russian empress should reach her ears. Maria Theresa would gladly have renewed her alliance with England, but that entente had been soured by England's separate peace with Prussia in 1745, which had compelled Austria to surrender Silesia. Now England's foreign policy was turning to protect her trade in the Baltic against the power of Russia and her hold on Hanover against any threat from Prussia or France. She depended upon Russia for the timber of her navy, and she depended upon her navy for victory in war. So on September 30th, 1755, England signed a treaty that bound Russia, in return for English subsidies, to maintain 55,000 troops in Livonia. These, the English hoped, would deter Frederick from any expansionist adventures to the west. But how should England deal with France? For hundreds of years France had been her enemy. Time and again France had fomented or financed Scottish hostilities to England. Repeatedly she had prepared or threatened to invade the British Isles. Now she was the only state that challenged Britain on the seas and in the colonial world. To defeat France decisively would be to win her colonies in America and India. It would be to destroy her navy or render it impotent. The British Empire would then be not only secure, but supreme. So William Pitt the Elder argued to Parliament day after day in the most forceful oratory that body had ever heard. But could France be defeated? Yes, said Pitt, by allying Prussia to England. Would it not be dangerous to let Prussia grow stronger? No, Pitt answered. Prussia had a great army, which on this plan would help England to protect Hanover, but she had no navy, and therefore could not rival Britain on the sea. It seemed wiser to let Protestant Prussia replace Catholic France or Catholic Austria as the dominant power on the continent, if that would let Britannia rule the waves and capture colonies. Any victories of Frederick in Europe would strengthen England overseas. Hence Pitt's boast that he would win America and India on the battlefields of the continent. England would supply money, Frederick would fight the land battles, England would win half the world. Parliament consented. Britain proposed to Prussia a pact for mutual defense. Frederick had to accept this plan, for the development of events had clouded his victories. He knew that France was flirting with Austria. If France and Austria, worse yet if Russia too, should unite against him, he could hardly resist them all. In such a predicament only England could help him. If he signed the pact that England offered, he could call upon her to keep Russia from attacking him, and if Russia abstained, Austria might be dissuaded from war. On January 16, 1756, Frederick signed the Treaty of Westminster, which pledged both England and Prussia to oppose the entry of foreign troops into Germany. That single clause, they hoped, would protect Prussia from Russia and Hanover from France. France, Austria, and Russia all felt that this treaty was a betrayal by their allies. There had been no formal termination of the alliances that had bound England with Austria and France with Prussia in the War of the Austrian Succession. Maria Theresa, as she informed the British ambassador, was shocked to learn that her English friends had signed a pact with the mortal and constant enemy of my person and my family. Louis XV complained that Frederick had deceived him. Frederick replied that the treaty was purely defensive and should give no offense to any power not meditating offense. Madame de Pompadour, who chose and dominated French ministries, remembered that Frederick had charged her with depositing great sums in British banks, and had called her La Demoiselle Poisson, Miss Fish, and Cotillon the Fourth, Petticoat the fourth mistress of Louis XV. Louis remembered that Frederick had ridiculed the barnyard morals of the French king. The desertion struck France just when her armies and treasury were exhausted, and when her navy was only beginning to recover from the neglect it had suffered under the pacific ministry of Cardinal Fleury. In 1756, France had 45 ships of the line, England had 130. Naval supplies were clogged with corruption and theft, naval discipline had been ruined by the invidious promotion of titled incompetents and the frequency of defeats. To whom now could France turn for an ally? To Russia? But England had forestalled her. To Austria? But in the last war, France had violated her pledge to guarantee Maria Theresa's inheritance, had joined Prussia in attacking her, and had continued to attack her even when Frederick had made peace. Austria under the Habsburgs, France under the Bourbons, had been foes for centuries. How could they and their peoples, long trained to mutual hatred, suddenly become friends? Yet that was precisely the reversal of alliances that the Austrian government now proposed to France. So far as we can now trace its history, the plan took form in the mind of Count Wenzel Anton von Kaunitz, the ablest, most penetrating, most persevering diplomat produced on the European continent in the 18th century. The 7 Years' War was to be a contest in arms between Frederick the Great and Marshal Daun, and a contest in brains between Kaunitz and Pitt. Prince Kaunitz, said Frederick, has the wisest head in Europe. Being a second son, Kaunitz was told to become a priest. Instead, privately, he became a disciple of Voltaire. As his father served as ambassador to the Vatican and as governor of Moravia, the son inherited diplomacy. At 31, he was the Austrian envoy at Turin. His first dispatch to his government was so logically reasoned on such careful observation of political realities that Count von Ulfeldt, presenting it to Maria Theresa, said, "Behold your first minister." At 37, he was Austrian plenipotentiary at the Congress of Aix-la-Chapelle. There he defended the interests of Maria Theresa with such pertinacity and skill that even in her defeat the Empress was grateful for his services and devotion. and when, as early as 1749, he broached to her his plan for an alliance with France, she met with an open mind the idea of embracing the traditional enemy of her house. Her heart was set on defeating Frederick and regaining Silesia, but this, Kaunitz explained, could not be done by alliance with England, whose power was on the seas. It required alliance with France and Russia, whose power was on the land. Between these and Austria, Frederick could be crushed. The Empress bade Kaunitz labor to this end. In 1751 he was sent as ambassador to Paris. He astonished the nobility by the splendor of his official entry to the city. He pleased the populace by giving alms. He amused the salons with his luxurious raiment, his assortment of cosmetics, and his laboriously powdered curls. A most high-sniffing, fantastic, slightly insolent fellow, thought Carlyle. But he impressed the king, his mistress, and their ministers by his knowledge of affairs and his appraisal of policies. Gradually he prepared their minds for an entente with Austria. He pictured the possibility of bringing Russia, Poland, and Saxony into taking part in disciplining Frederick. He asked what France had gained by her alliance with Prussia, only the aggrandizement of a land power that challenged the continental hegemony of France. And had not Frederick repeatedly broken his pledge when it suited his interest? Kaunitz was making good headway when Maria Theresa called him back to Vienna to be her chancellor, with full power over both domestic and foreign affairs. This in 1753. His plan was long opposed by the aging nobles at the Viennese court. Patiently he expounded and defended it. The Empress supported him, and on August 21, 1755, the proposal for an alliance with France received the formal approval of the imperial ministry. Count Georg von Staremberg, who had succeeded Kaunitz as Austrian ambassador at Paris, was instructed to promote the grand design at every opportunity with Louis XV and Madame de Pompadour. Kaunitz sent a flattering letter to the maîtresse en titre on August 30, 1755, and attached to it a note which she was requested to hand secretly to the king. She did so. The note was from Maria Theresa, and read, "As an empress and a queen, I promise that nothing will ever be disclosed of all that is going to be offered in my name by Count Staremberg to the most Christian king, and that the deepest secrecy in this respect will always be maintained, whether negotiations succeed or fail. It will be understood, of course, that the king will give a similar declaration and promise. Vienna, June 21, 1755. Louis appointed the Abbé de Bernis and the Marquise de Pompadour to confer privately with Staremberg at her pavilion, Babioles. There the ambassador proposed, in the name of the Empress, that France should renounce her alliance with Prussia, and should pledge at least financial aid to Austria in case of war. He argued that Frederick was a useless and unreliable ally, and he hinted that Frederick was even now engaged in clandestine dealings with the British ministry. Austria, for her part, would refrain from any hostile action against France if France should make war upon England. In case of such a war, Austria would allow France to occupy Ostend and Nieuport, and she might ultimately allow the Austrian Netherlands to fall to France. Louis noted that the pact would involve him in an Austrian war against Prussia, but would not pledge Austrian aid to France against England. He had good reason to fear Frederick's army more than the Austrian, so often defeated and so badly led in the recent war. He instructed Bernis to reply that France would make no change in her alliance with Prussia until proofs were offered of Frederick's dealings with England. Kaunitz could as yet offer no such proofs, and was temporarily checked in his course. But when Louis received Frederick's acknowledgment of the Anglo-Prussian Treaty of Westminster, he saw that his alliance with Prussia was factually dead. Perhaps amid his sins it occurred to him that he might appease the Almighty by uniting the Catholic powers, France, Austria, Poland, and Spain, in a plan to control the destinies of Europe. On May 1, 1756, the Treaty of Versailles completed the reversal of alliances. The preamble professed that the sole aim of the convention was to maintain the peace of Europe and the balance of power. If either of the contracting parties should be threatened in its European possessions by any power but England, the other would come to its aid by diplomatic intercession, and if necessary by subsidies or troops. Austria would not promise aid to France against England, and France would not aid Austria against Prussia unless Prussia should be clearly the aggressor. As Louis saw no likelihood of Prussia endangering her gains by again attacking Austria, he and his mistress could deceive themselves into believing that the new alliance made for peace on the continent. Kaunitz had as yet fallen short of his aim to secure French aid against Prussia, but he was patient. Perhaps he could prod Frederick into attacking Austria. Meanwhile, he had little difficulty in persuading the Tsarina into the new alliance. Elizaveta was eager to remove the Prussian obstacle to Russia's expansion westward. She offered to attack Prussia before the end of 1756 if Austria would promise to do likewise, and she promised in that event to make no peace with Prussia until Silesia was completely restored to Austria. She learned with delight that France had signed the Treaty of Versailles. Kaunitz had to check her enthusiasm. He knew that her armies would not be ready for a major campaign till 1757. Not until December 31st, 1756, did he sign the agreement by which Russia formally joined the Franco-Austrian Entente. Meanwhile, England, confident that her alliance with Frederick would immobilize Austria, had already begun naval operations against France, without any declaration of war. From June 1755, English men of war seized French shipping wherever possible. France retaliated by preparing an invasion of England and by sending a squadron of 15 vessels under the Duc de Richelieu to attack Minorca. This island had been captured by the British in the War of the Spanish Succession in 1709. To reinforce the small garrison there, Britain dispatched 10 ships under Admiral John Byng. 3 additional vessels joined these at Gibraltar. On May 20th, 1756, the hostile fleets engaged near Minorca. The French were repulsed, but the English squadron suffered such damage that Byng led it back to Gibraltar, making no attempt to land reinforcements at Minorca. The helpless garrison surrendered. France had now a strategic post in the Mediterranean. Richelieu was hailed as a hero in Paris and Versailles, and Byng was executed on his own quarterdeck in Portsmouth Harbor on March 14, 1757, on the charge of failure to do his utmost for victory. Voltaire and Richelieu interceded for him in vain. This, said Voltaire, was England's way of encouraging the others who held British commands. On May 17, 1756, England declared war on France, but the official inception of the 7 Years' War was left to Frederick. He knew that his conquest of Silesia had left him subject to revanche whenever Maria Theresa should find new resources and allies. His own resources were perilously limited. His kingdom was an assortment of disiecta membra. East Prussia was severed from Prussia proper by Poland, and the Prussian provinces in Westphalia and East Frisia were separated from Brandenburg by independent German states. Including these scattered fragments and Silesia, all Prussia had in 1756 some 4 million population, England 8 million, France 20. A large part of Prussia's population was in Silesia, which was still half Catholic and pro-Austrian. Only 7 miles from Berlin lay the border of hostile Saxony, whose elector, the Catholic King Augustus III of Poland, looked upon Frederick as an insolent and rapacious infidel. How could one survive in that cauldron of enmity? Only by wits, economy, a good army, and good generals. His own wits were as keen as any. He was the best educated ruler of his age. He came off with honors in correspondence, conversation, and controversy with Voltaire. But his tongue was too sharp to be loosed. He might have had calmer seas had he not spoken of Elizaveta Petrovna, Maria Theresa, and Madame de Pompadour as the 3 first whores of Europe. It is comforting to see that even the great can be foolish now and then. As to the economy of Prussia, Frederick subjected it to state control and what seemed to him the unavoidable needs of possible war. He did not dare, in the circumstances, to change the feudal structure of Prussian life, lest it disturb the feudal organization of his army. That army was his salvation and his religion. 90% of his revenues went to its maintenance. He called it the Atlas whose strong shoulders carried the state. He built it up from the 100,000 men bequeathed him by his father to 150,000 in 1756. He disciplined it with severe punishments to immediate and precise obedience, to march steadily toward the opposing line without firing a shot till ordered, to change direction and maneuver en masse under fire. It had at the beginning of the war the best generals in Europe after Frederick himself, Schwerin, Seydlitz, and James Keith. Almost as important as his generals were the spies that he had scattered among his enemies. They left him no doubt that Maria Theresa was forming a cordon of hostile powers around him. In 1753-55, his agents in Dresden and Warsaw secured copies of secret correspondence between the Saxon and Austrian ministries, which convinced him that these courts were conspiring to attack, and, if fortune favored, dismember Prussia, and that France was conniving at the scheme. On June 23, 1756, he ordered the Prussian general in Königsberg to be prepared for an attack from Russia. He notified the British government that the court of Vienna had 3 designs to which its present steps are tending: to establish its despotism in the empire, to ruin the Protestant cause, and to reconquer Silesia. He learned that Saxony was planning to enlarge its army from 17,000 to 40,000 during the winter. He guessed that the Allies were waiting for the spring of 1757 to advance upon him from 3 directions, and he resolved to strike before their mobilization was complete. He felt that his only chance of escaping from his peril was to disable at least one of his foes before they could unite in action. Schwerin agreed with him, but one of his ministers, Count von Podewils, begged him not to give his enemies excuse for branding him as the aggressor. Frederick called him Monsieur de la Timide Politique. Long ago, in a secret political testament of 1752, he had advised his successor to conquer Saxony and thereby give Prussia the geographical unity, the economic resources, and the political power indispensable to survival. He had put the idea aside as beyond himself to realize. Now it seemed to him a military necessity. He must protect his western frontier by disarming Saxony. Even in his almost idealistic Anti-Machiavel of 1740, he had sanctioned an offensive war to forestall a threatened attack. Mitchell, the Prussian minister in England, informed him that while the British government strongly desired the maintenance of peace on the continent, it recognized the emergency that Frederick faced and would not hold him in the least to blame if he tried to forestall his enemies instead of waiting until they carried out their hostile intentions. In July 1756, he sent an envoy to Maria Theresa soliciting assurance that Austria intended no attack upon Prussia either in the current year or in the next. A member of the Austrian cabinet thought such assurance should be given. Kaunitz refused to send it. All that Maria Theresa would say was that in the present crisis, I deem it necessary to take measures for the security of myself and my allies, which tend to the prejudice of no one. Frederick sent a second message to the Empress asking for a clearer reply to his request for assurance. She answered that she had concluded no offensive alliance, and although the critical situation of Europe compelled her to arm, she had no intention to violate the Treaty of Dresden, which pledged her to peace with Frederick, but she would not bind herself by any promise from acting as circumstances required. Frederick had anticipated such a reply. Before it reached him, he led his army into Saxony on August 29, 1756. So began the 7 Years' War. 2. The Outlaw, 1756-57. He made a half-hearted attempt to enlist the Saxon elector as an ally, offering him Maria Theresa's Bohemia as a bribe. Augustus scorned this vicarious philanthropy. He ordered his generals to stop Frederick's advance and fled to Warsaw. The Saxon force was too small to resist the finest army in Europe. It withdrew to the citadel at Pirna. Frederick entered Dresden unopposed on September 9, 1756. At once he bade his agents open the Saxon archives and bring him the originals of those documents that had revealed Saxony's participation in the plan to chasten, perhaps to dismember, Prussia. The aging Electress Queen with her own person barred access to the archives and demanded that Frederick should respect her royal inviolability. He ordered her to be removed. She fled. The documents were secured. Maria Theresa sent an army from Bohemia to dislodge the invader. Frederick met it and defeated it at Lobositz on the road from Dresden to Prague on October 1st. He returned to besiege Pirna. It surrendered on October 15th. He impressed the 14,000 captive Saxon soldiers into his own divisions, arguing that this was cheaper than feeding them as prisoners. The German appetite was notorious. He declared Saxony a conquered country and applied its revenues to his own needs. During the winter, he published the Saxon documents to the world. Maria Theresa called them forgeries and appealed to France, Russia, and all God-fearing Christians to aid her against the man who, by flagrant aggression, had again plunged Europe into war. Europe generally agreed in condemning Frederick. The German principalities, fearing a fate like Saxony's if Frederick should triumph, declared war upon Prussia on January 17, 1757, and raised a Reichsarmee, or imperial army, for action against the Prussian king. Kaunitz lost no time in reminding Louis XV that France had promised to help in case Austria should be threatened. The Dauphine, daughter of the Saxon elector, pleaded with her father-in-law to rescue her father. Madame de Pompadour, who had hoped to enjoy her reign in peace, now inclined to war. In appreciation of her aid, Maria Theresa sent her a royal portrait decorated with gems valued at 77,278 livres. Pompadour became Marshal. Louis, usually slow to decide, decided with impetuous vigor. By a second Treaty of Versailles on May 1, 1757, France bound herself in defensive-offensive alliance with Austria, pledged her an annual subsidy of 12 million florins, agreed to equip 2 German armies, and proposed to devote a French force of 105,000 men to the destruction totale de la Prusse. She promised never to make peace with Prussia until Silesia had been restored to Austria. When that restoration had been consummated, France was to receive 5 frontier towns in the Austrian Netherlands, and these southern Netherlands were to be transferred to the Bourbon Infante of Spain in return for Spanish duchies in Italy. Perhaps France was knowingly writing off her colonies to British conquest by devoting nearly all her resources to absorbing Belgium. Kaunitz could feel that he had won a vital diplomatic victory. He found it easy now to draw Russia into active aid. The Convention of St. Petersburg on February 2, 1757, committed Russia and Austria each to put 80,000 troops into the field and to make war until Silesia had been reunited with Austria and Prussia had been reduced to a minor power. Turning to Sweden, Kaunitz brought her into the alliance by guaranteeing to her, in the event of victory, all that part of Pomerania which had been conceded to her in the Treaty of Westphalia. Sweden was to contribute 25,000 men, Austria and France were to finance them. Poland, under its refugee king Augustus III, pledged her modest resources to the Franco-Austrian alliance. Now nearly all of Europe except England, Hanover, Denmark, Holland, Switzerland, Turkey, and Hesse-Kassel was united against Frederick. And England was tempted to leave Frederick to his fate. George II saw with horror that his beloved Hanover, the electorate from which his father had come to rule Britain, lay defenseless in the path of overwhelming armies, with Frederick too distant and harassed to send substantial aid. The temptation was made almost irresistible when Kaunitz offered to leave Hanover inviolate if England would keep out of the Continental War. At that moment Frederick's fate was touch and go. Pitt, who was appointed Secretary of State on November 19, 1756, was at first inclined to let Prussia and Hanover shift for themselves, while England would concentrate all her martial resources upon the contest for colonies. Little wonder that George II, loving Hanover, hated Pitt. Soon Pitt changed his mind and declared that a France victorious against Frederick would be master of Europe, and soon of England too. Parliament must vote money for Frederick and troops for Hanover. France must be made to spend herself in Europe, while England would pluck colonies and markets out of the conquered seas. So in January 1757, Britain signed a second alliance with Prussia, promising subsidies to Frederick and soldiers to Hanover. But then suddenly Pitt was dismissed on April 5th. Politics befuddled policy, help to Frederick was delayed, and for almost a year he stood alone, with 145,000 men, against armies converging from every quarter upon him. In the west, 105,000 troops from France and 20,000 from the German states. In the south, 133,000 from Austria. In the east, 60,000 from Russia. In the north, 16,000 from Sweden. And on that same day which saw Pitt fall, the Emperor Francis I, the usually amiable and docile husband of Maria Theresa, officially branded Frederick as an outlaw, and called upon all good men to hunt him out as an impious enemy of mankind. 3. From Prague to Rossbach, 1757. On January 10th, Frederick sent to his ministers in Berlin some secret instructions. "If I am killed, affairs must continue without the slightest alteration. If I have the bad luck to be captured, I forbid the smallest consideration for my person, or the slightest attention to anything I may write in captivity." It was a useless gesture, for without his military genius, Prussia was lost. His only hope lay in facing his foes one at a time before they could unite. The French were not yet ready for battle, and perhaps the regiments that England was sending to Hanover could hold them for a while. The Austrians were accumulating in nearby Bohemia and Moravia immense magazines of arms and provisions to equip their armies for an invasion of Silesia. Frederick decided first to capture those precious stores, fight the Austrians, then march back to face the French. He led his own force from Saxony and ordered the Duke of Brunswick-Bevern from East Germany and Marshal Schwerin from Silesia to advance into Bohemia and meet him in the hills overlooking Prague from the west. It was so done. The magazines were captured, and on May 6th, near Prague, 64,000 Prussians met 61,000 Austrians under Prince Charles of Lorraine in the first great battle of the war. The issue was decided not by numbers nor by strategy, but by courage. Schwerin's regiments, under Austrian fire, marched waist-deep, shoulder-deep through morasses. For a time they lost heart and turned in flight. Then Schwerin, aged 73, rallied them, wrapped the colors about his body, rode straight in the face of the foe, was struck by 5 balls at once, and fell dead. His men, loving him almost more than they feared death, charged in fury against the enemy and turned defeat into victory. The slaughter on both sides was enormous, and Frederick's losses included 400 officers and his best general. In this war, generals did not die in bed. The 46,000 surviving Austrians retired into their citadel in Prague and prepared to resist siege. But Frederick found siege difficult, for Marshal Leopold von Daun, ablest of the Austrian commanders, was coming up from Moravia with another 64,000 men. Leaving part of his army to blockade the citadel, Frederick marched eastward with 32,000 troops and met the advancing masses at Kolin on June 16th. The odds against him were too great, and the generalship of Daun was in this case superior to his own. 2 of Frederick's generals disobeyed his orders, causing confusion. Frederick lost his temper and shouted to his retreating cavalry, "Would you live forever?" The infantry, overwhelmed by carnage, refused to advance. Frederick, despondent, withdrew from the field, leaving 14,000 Prussians dead, wounded, or prisoners. He led his 18,000 survivors back to Prague, abandoned the siege, and returned with his remnants toward Saxony. At Leitmeritz he rested his army for 3 weeks. There, on July 2nd, he received word that his mother, Sophia Dorothea, had died. The iron man of war broke down, wept, and secluded himself for a day. Perhaps he wondered now whether his assault on Silesia, 17 years before, had been a foolish tempting of Nemesis. He shared his grief with his sister, Wilhelmina, Margravine of Bayreuth, whom he loved beyond any other soul. On July 7th, his pride nearly spent, he sent her a desperate appeal. "Since you, my dear sister, insist upon undertaking the great work of peace, I beg you to be good enough to send Monsieur de Mirabeau to offer the favorite, Madame de Pompadour, formerly Cotillon IV, as much as 500,000 crowns for peace. I leave it all to you, whom I adore, and who, although far more accomplished than myself, is another myself." Nothing came of this approach. Wilhelmina tried another way. She wrote to Voltaire, then living in Switzerland, and begged him to use his influence. Voltaire transmitted her proposal to Cardinal de Tencin, who had opposed the Franco-Austrian alliance. Tencin tried and failed. The allies were sniffing the scent of victory. Maria Theresa now talked of completely dismembering Frederick's realm. Not only must Silesia and Glatz be restored to her, but Magdeburg and Halberstadt were to go to Augustus III, Pomerania was to revert to Sweden, and Cleves and Ravensburg were to reward the Elector Palatine. Her hopes seemed reasonable. A French army of the Dauphin had entered Germany. Part of it, under Pompadour's favorite general, the Prince de Soubise, was coming to join with the imperial army at Erfurt. Another part, under Maréchal d'Estrées, advanced to meet a Hanoverian force under George II's son, the Duke of Cumberland. Near the village of Hostenbeck, the French so badly defeated this army on July 26th that the Duke signed at Klosterzeven on September 8th a convention by which he promised to keep his Hanoverian troops from any further action against France. Word of this humiliating capitulation may have reached Frederick at approximately the same time as news that a Swedish army had landed in Pomerania and a Russian army of 100,000 men under Marshal Stepan Apraxian had invaded East Prussia and overwhelmed a force of 30,000 Prussians at Gross-Jägersdorf on July 30th. These reverses, adding to his own debacle in Bohemia, almost destroyed Frederick's hope of overcoming enemies so numerous and so fortified with reserves of materials and men. Having abandoned the morality as well as the theology of Christianity, he fell back upon the ethics of the Stoics and meditated suicide. To the end of the war he carried on his person a phial of poison. He was resolved that his foes should never take him except as a corpse. On August 24th, he sent to Wilhelmina a semi-hysterical paean to death. "And now, ye promoters of sacred lies, go on leading cowards by the nose. To me the enchantment of life is ended, the charm disappears. I see that all men are but the sport of destiny, and that if there do exist some gloomy and inexorable being who allows a despised herd of creatures to go on multiplying here, he values them as nothing. He looks down upon a Phalaris crowned and a Socrates in chains, upon our virtues and our misdeeds, upon the horror of war and the cruel plagues that ravage the earth, as things indifferent to him. Wherefore my sole refuge and only haven, dear sister, is in the arms of death." She answered on September 15th by vowing to join him in suicide. "My dearest brother, your letter and the one you wrote to Voltaire have almost killed me. What fatal resolutions, great God! Ah, my dear brother, you say you love me, and yet you drive a dagger into my heart. Your letter made me shed rivers of tears. Now I am ashamed of such weakness. Your lot shall be mine. I will not survive either your misfortunes or those of the house I belong to. You may calculate that such is my firm resolution. But after this avowal, let me entreat you to look back at what was the pitiable state of your enemy when you lay before Prague. It is the sudden whirl of fortune for both parties. Caesar was once the slave of pirates and became lord of the earth. A great genius like yours finds resources even when all seems lost. I suffer 1,000 times more than I can tell you. Nevertheless, hope does not abandon me. I must finish, but I shall never cease to be, with the most profound respect, your Wilhelmina." She appealed to Voltaire to support her plea, and early in October, in his first letter to Frederick since 1753, he seconded her arguments. "The Catos and Othos, whose death your Majesty thinks noble, had nothing else they could do but fight or die. You must keep in mind how many courts there are that see in your invasion of Saxony a violation of international law. Our morality and your situation are far from requiring such an act as suicide. Your life is needed. You know how dear it is to a numerous family. The affairs of Europe are never long on the same basis, and it is the duty of a man like you to hold himself in readiness for events. If your courage led you to that heroic extremity, it would not be approved. Your partisans would condemn it, your enemies would triumph." To which Frederick replied in prose and verse, "As for me, menaced with shipwreck, I must, confronting the storm, think, live, and die like a king." Between poems, always in French, he searched for the French army. Now he longed for a battle that would settle for him the question of life or death. At Leipzig, October 15th, he sent for Johann Christoph Gottsched, who wrote verses in German, and tried to convince him that German poetry was impossible. So many explosions, knapp, klopp, krotz, krok, so many gutturals, so many consonants, even in the professor's name 5 in a row. How could you make a melody with such a language? Gottsched protested. Frederick had to prepare for another march, but 10 days later, back in Leipzig, he received the old poet again, found time to listen to a Gottsched ode in German, and gave him a gold snuff-box as a parting token of goodwill. During that literary interlude, more bad news came. A force of Croats under Count Hadik was advancing upon Berlin, and and rumor said that Swedish and French battalions were converging upon the Prussian capital. Frederick had left a garrison there, but far too small to buffet such an avalanche. If Berlin should fall, his principal source of supplies in arms, powder, and clothing would be in the hands of the enemy. He hurried with his army to rescue the city and his family. On the march he received word that no French or Swedish force was moving toward Berlin, that Haddick, halting in the suburbs, had exacted a ransom of 27,000 pounds from Berlin and had led his Croats contentedly away on October 16th. There was another comforting intelligence. The Russians under Prussian, racked with disease and famishing for food, had withdrawn from East Prussia into Poland. Less pleasant messages informed Frederick that the main French army under Soubise had entered Saxony, had plundered the western cities, and had united with the imperial army under the Duke of Saxe-Hildburghausen. The weary king turned back in his tracks and led his troops to the vicinity of Rossbach, some 30 miles west of Leipzig. There, his tired army, reduced to 21,000 men, came at last face to face with the 41,000 troops of France and the Reich. Even so, Soubise advised against risking battle. Better, he said, to continue evading Frederick and wearing him out with fruitless marches until the overwhelming superiority of the Allies in manpower and materials should force him to yield. Soubise knew the breakdown of discipline in his ranks and the lack of enthusiasm in the mostly Protestant soldiers of the Reichsarmee for fighting against Frederick. Hildburghausen pleaded for action, and Soubise gave in. The German marshal led his men on a long detour to attack the Prussians on their left flank. Frederick, watching from a housetop in Rossbach, ordered his cavalry under Seydlitz to execute a counter-movement against the right flank of the enemy. Screened by hills and proceeding with disciplined speed, the Prussian cavalry, 3,800 strong, charged down upon the Allied troops and overcame them before they could reform their ranks. The French came up too late and were shattered by the Prussian artillery. In 90 minutes, the crucial Battle of Rossbach was over, this on November 5, 1757. The Allies retreated in disorder, leaving 7,700 dead on the field. The Prussians lost only 550 men. Frederick ordered the prisoners to be well treated and invited the captured officers to share his table. With French grace and wit he excused the limited fare. "But, gentlemen, I did not expect you so soon in so great number." Military men on all sides marveled at the disproportion of the losses and at the superior generalship that had made this possible. Even France confessed admiration, and the French people, so lately allied with Prussia, could not yet look upon Frederick as their foe. Did he not speak and write good French? The philosophes applauded his victories and claimed him as their champion of free thought against the religious obscurantism that they were fighting at home. Frederick responded to the gallant emotions of the French by saying, "I am not accustomed to regard the French as enemies." But privately he composed in French a poem expressing his pleasure at having given the French a kick in the queue, which Carlyle delicately translated as the seat of honor. England rejoiced with him and put new faith in her ally. London celebrated his birthday with bonfires in the streets, and devout Methodists acclaimed the infidel hero as the savior of the one true religion. Pitt had been brought back to head the government on July 29, 1757. Henceforth he was the unswerving support of the Prussian king. "England has taken long to produce a great man for this contest," said Frederick, "but here is one at last." Pitt denounced the Convention of Klosterhaven as cowardice and treason, though the king's son had signed it. He persuaded Parliament to send a better army to protect Hanover and help Frederick in October. And whereas it had voted only £164,000 for Cumberland's Army of Observation, now it voted £1,200,000 for an Army of Operations. Pitt and Frederick united in choosing, as leader of this new force, Frederick's brother-in-law and military pupil, Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick, 36 years old, handsome, cultured, brave, who played the violin so well, said Burney, that he might have made his fortune by it. Here was an instrument nobly fit to play second fiddle to Frederick's flute. 4. The Fox at Bay, 1757-60. Frederick had not much leisure for rejoicing. A French army under Richelieu still held much of Hanover. On the very day of Rossbach, 43,000 Austrians laid siege to Schweidnitz, the principal stronghold and storehouse of the Prussians in Silesia. Frederick had left 41,000 men there, but they had been reduced by desertion and death to 28,000. These were poorly led by the Duke of Brunswick-Bevern, who ignored the king's order to attack the besiegers. On November 11th, he surrendered the fortress, yielding to the Austrians 7,000 prisoners, $330,000, and provisions sufficient to maintain 88,000 men for 2 months. The victors, amplified to 83,000 troops by union with forces under Prince Charles and Marshal Daun, went on to Breslau. On November 22nd, they overwhelmed a small force of Prussians. Breslau fell, and most of Silesia was now restored to the triumphant Maria Theresa. Frederick might well feel that his victory at Rossbach had been annulled. But that victory had renewed his courage, and he no longer spoke of suicide. His army, too, had recovered from its marches and battles, and seemed usefully resentful of the ravages with which French soldiers had desecrated Protestant churches in Saxony. Frederick appealed to his men to help him recapture Silesia. They marched 170 miles in 12 wintry days through difficult terrain. En route they were joined by the remains of the Prussian forces that had been defeated at Schweidnitz and Breslau. On December 3rd, Frederick, with 43,000 men, sighted the 72,000 Austrians who were encamped near Leuthen on the road to Breslau. That evening Frederick addressed his captains in a speech prefiguring the martial harangues of Napoleon. "It is not unknown to you, gentlemen, what disasters have befallen here while we were busy with the French and Imperial armies. Schweidnitz is gone, Breslau is gone, and all our war stores there. Most of Silesia is gone. My embarrassments would be beyond recovery if it were not for my unbounded confidence in your courage, your constancy, and your love for the fatherland. There is hardly one among you who has not distinguished himself by some conspicuous deed of valor. I flatter myself, therefore, that in the coming opportunity you will not fail in any sacrifice that your country may demand of you. This opportunity is close at hand. I should feel that I had accomplished nothing if Austria were left in possession of Silesia. Let me tell you, then, that I propose, in defiance of all the rules in the art of war, to attack the army of Prince Charles, 3 times as large as ours, wherever I find it. The question is not of his numbers or the strength of his position. All this, by the courage of our troops and the careful execution of our plans, I hope to overcome. I must take this step, or all will be lost. We must defeat the enemy, or we shall lie buried under his batteries. So I read the case, so I shall act. Make my determination known to all officers of the army. Prepare the men for the work that is to come, and tell them that I feel justified in demanding exact fulfillment of orders. For you, when I reflect that you are Prussians, can I think that you will act unworthily? But if there should be one or another among you who dreads to share all dangers with me," here Frederick looked into each face in turn, "he can have his discharge this evening, and shall suffer not the least reproach from me. I know that none of you would desert me. I count then absolutely on your faithful help, and on certain victory. Should I not survive to reward you for your devotion, the fatherland must do it. Return now to camp and report to your troops what you have heard from me. The cavalry regiment that does not at once, on receipt of the order, throw itself upon the enemy, I will, directly after the battle, unhorse and make it a garrison regiment. The infantry battalion that even begins to hesitate, no matter what the danger may be, shall lose its colors, its swords, and the gold lace from its uniforms. And now, gentlemen, good night. Soon we shall have beaten the enemy, or we shall see each other no more." Heretofore the Austrians, following a Fabian policy, had avoided battle with Frederick, hesitating to pit their troops and generals against Prussian discipline and Frederick's tactical genius. But now, inspired by superior numbers and recent victories, they decided, against the advice of Marshal Daun, to face the king in battle. And so, on December 5th, 1757, the human pawns of dynastic rivalry, 43,000 against 73,000, advanced upon each other's swords and guns in the greatest battle of the war. That battle, said Napoleon, was a masterpiece. Of itself it suffices to entitle Frederick to a place in the first rank among generals. He sought first to gain the hills, from which his artillery could fire over the heads of his infantry into the enemy's ranks. He deployed his troops in an oblique order anciently used by Epaminondas of Thebes. Separate columns were to move at approximately 45-degree angles to strike the enemy sidewise and so disorder his line of defense. Frederick pretended to be aiming his strongest pressure against the Austrian right. Prince Charles weakened his left wing to reinforce the right. Frederick poured his best troops upon the diminished left, routed it, and then turned to attack the right wing on its flank, while the Prussian cavalry rode down upon that same wing from concealment in the hills. Order triumphed over disorder. The Austrians surrendered or fled. 20,000 of them were taken prisoner, a catch unprecedented in military history. 3,000 more were left dead, and 116 pieces of artillery fell into Prussian hands. The Prussians, too, lost heavily, 1,141 dead, 5,118 wounded, 85 captured. When the carnage was over, Frederick thanked his generals. "This day will bring the renown of your name and of the nation to the latest posterity." The victor pursued his victory with passionate resolve to regain Silesia. Within a day after the battle, his army besieged the Austrian garrison in Breslau. Sprecher, its commander, posted placards through the town proclaiming instant death for anyone who breathed a word of surrender. 12 days later, December 18th, he surrendered. Frederick took there 17,000 prisoners and precious military stores. Soon all Silesia, except heavily garrisoned and fortified Schweidnitz, was back in Prussian hands. Prince Charles, humble before Daun's silent reproaches, retired to his estate in Austria. Bernis and other French leaders advised Louis XV to make peace. Pompadour overruled them and replaced Bernis with the Duc de Choiseul as Minister for Foreign Affairs in 1758. But France, suspecting that she was fighting for Austria while sacrificing her colonies, lost heart for the war. Richelieu showed so little enthusiasm, so little fervor in pursuing his advantage in Hanover, that he was recalled from his command in February 1758. He was replaced by the Comte de Clermont, an abbé licensed by the Pope to keep his benefice while playing general. The French evacuated Hanover before the resolute advances of Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick. They yielded Minden to him in March. Soon all Westphalia was freed from the French, who thereto had made themselves hated by plunder and desecration. Ferdinand marched west and, with half as many men, defeated Clermont's main force at Krefeld on the Rhine on June 23rd. Clermont yielded his post to the Duc de Contades. The defeated army was joined by Soubise with new French levies and the survivors of Rossbach. Before this united force, Ferdinand withdrew to Münster and Paderborn. Encouraged by a season of victories, England signed on April 11th a third treaty with Frederick, promising him a subsidy of £670,000 by October, and pledging herself against a separate peace. Meanwhile, Frederick, his own Prussia having been taxed to exhaustion, taxed Saxony and other conquered territory likewise. He issued debased currencies and, like Voltaire, hired Jewish financiers to make profitable deals for him in foreign exchange. By the spring of 1758, he had rebuilt his army to 145,000 men. In April, he attacked and recovered Schweidnitz. Eluding the main Austrian army, reconstituted under Daun, he moved south with 70,000 men to Olmütz in Moravia. If he could capture this Austrian stronghold, he hoped to march against Vienna itself. But about this same time, 50,000 Russians under the Count of Firmer swept over East Prussia and attacked Küstrin, only 50 miles east of Berlin. Frederick abandoned the siege of Olmütz and hurried north with 15,000 men. On the way he learned that Wilhelmina was critically ill. He stopped at Grusau to send her an anxious note. "O you, dearest of my family, you whom I have most at heart of all beings in this world, for the sake of whatever is most precious to you, preserve yourself, and let me have the consolation of shedding my tears on your breast." After days and nights on the march, he joined a Prussian force under Count Zudona near Küstrin. On August 25, 1758, with 36,000 men, he faced Firmer's 42,000 Russians at Zorndorf. His favorite tactic of a flank attack was here made impossible by marshy ground. Firmer proved as resourceful in command as Frederick, and the Russians fought with a courage and pertinacity that the Prussians seldom encountered in the Austrians or the French. Seydlitz and his cavalry won whatever honors could come from a day of rival butchery. The Russians retreated in good order, leaving 21,000 dead, wounded, or captured. The Prussians lost 12,500 killed or wounded, and 1,000 prisoners. But who could continue to fight on so many fronts at once? While Frederick was in the north, Daun had led his army to a junction with the imperial regiments and was now besieging Dresden, where Frederick had left a garrison under Prince Henry. A force of 16,000 Swedes marched through Pomerania, joined the Russians in ravaging a great part of the Mark of Brandenburg, and might with them endanger Berlin again. A new army of 30,000 Austrians and Hungarians under General Harsch entered Silesia and headed for Breslau. Which of the three capitals should be defended first? Reorganizing his dispirited and now rebellious troops, Frederick marched them 22 miles a day across Prussia into Saxony and reached his beleaguered brother just in time to discourage Daun from attack. After giving his men 2 weeks' rest, he set out to drive Harsch from Silesia. At Hochkirch, in Silesia, Daun blocked his path. Frederick pitched camp close to the enemy and waited 4 days for provisions to arrive from Dresden. Suddenly, at 5 o'clock on the morning of October 14, 1758, Daun, whom Frederick had relied upon to avoid the initiative, fell upon the Prussian right wing. The movement of the Austrians had been concealed by a thick fog. The Prussians were literally caught napping. They had no time to form the tactical lines that Frederick had designed. Frederick exposed himself recklessly in his efforts to restore order. He succeeded, but too late to retrieve the situation. After 5 hours of battle, 37,000 pawns against 90,000, he gave the signal for retreat, leaving on the field 9,450 men, to the Austrian loss of 7,590. Again he contemplated suicide. With so able a general as Daun leading the Austrians, with so able a general as Saltykov forming a new Russian army, and with his own forces declining in number, quality, and discipline, while his foes could make up any loss, it seemed clear that a Prussian victory could come only through a miracle, and Frederick did not believe in miracles. On the day after Hochkirch, he showed to his reader, Decat, an apology for suicide which he had composed, and said, "I can end the tragedy when I choose." On that day, October 15, 1758, Wilhelmina died, leaving instructions that her brother's letters to her might be laid on her breast in her tomb. Frederick appealed to Voltaire to write something in her memory. Voltaire responded well, but his ode to the âme héroïque et pure could not match the simple fervor of the king's tribute in his Histoire de la guerre de 7 ans. The goodness of her heart, her generous and benevolent inclinations, the nobility and elevation of her soul, the sweetness of her character, brought together in her the brilliant gifts of the mind with the foundation of solid virtue. The tenderest and most constant friendship united the king, Frederick wrote in the third person, and this worthy sister. These ties had been formed in their earliest childhood. The same education and the same sentiments had further bound them, and a mutual fidelity in every test had rendered these ties indissoluble. Spring brought new French armies into the field. On April 13, 1759, at Bergen, near Frankfurt am Main, a French force ably led by the Duc de Broglie gave Ferdinand of Brunswick a taste of defeat. But Ferdinand redeemed himself at Minden. There, on August 1st, with 43,000 Germans, English, and Scots, he routed 60,000 French under Broglie and Contades so decisively, and with relatively so little loss, that he was able to send 12,000 troops to Frederick to make good the weakening of the king's army by a disastrous campaign in the east. On July 23rd, Saltykov's 50,000 Russians, Croats, and Cossacks overwhelmed at Zulikau the 26,000 Prussians whom Frederick had left to guard the approaches from Poland to Berlin. Nothing there now stood in the way of a Russian avalanche upon the Prussian capital. The king had no choice but to rely upon his brother to hold Dresden against Daun, while he himself marched to face the Russians. Reinforced on the way, he was able to muster 48,000 men, but meanwhile 18,000 Austrians under General Laudon had joined the Russians, raising Saltykov's total to 68,000. On August 12, 1759, these two armies, the largest masses of expendable human flesh since the competitive slaughters of the War of the Spanish Succession, fought at Kunersdorf, 60 miles east of Berlin, the most merciless and for Frederick the most tragic battle of the war. After 12 hours of fighting, he seemed to have the advantage. Then Laudon's 18,000 men, who had been kept in reserve, fell upon the exhausted Prussians and drove them into a rout. Frederick dared every danger to rally his troops. 3 times he led them personally to the attack. 3 horses were shot under him. A small gold case in his pocket stopped a bullet that might have ended his career. He was not happy over his escape. "Is there not," he cried, "one devil of a ball that can reach me?" His soldiers begged him to retire to safety, and soon they gave him every example. He appealed to them, "Children, don't abandon me now, your king, your father." But no urging could get them to advance again. Many of them had fought 6 hours under a burning sun and without time or chance for a cup of water. They fled, and at last he joined them, leaving behind him 20,000 captured, wounded, or dead, against an enemy loss of 15,700. Among the mortally wounded was Ewald von Kleist, the finest German poet of that age. As soon as Frederick could find a place to rest, he dispatched a message to Prince Henry. "Of an army of 48,000 men I have at this moment not more than 3,000, and I am no longer master of my forces. It is a great calamity, and I will not survive it." He notified his generals that he was bequeathing his command to Prince Henry. Then he dropped upon some straw and fell asleep. The next morning he found that 23,000 fugitives from the battle had returned to their regiments, ashamed of their flight, and ready to serve him again if only because they longed to eat. Frederick forgot to kill himself. Instead, he reorganized these and other poor souls into a new force of 32,000 troops, and took a stand on the road from Kunersdorf to Berlin, expecting to make a last attempt to protect his capital. But Saltykov did not come. His men, too, had to eat. They were in enemy country and found foraging dangerous, and the line of communications with friendly Poland was long and hazardous. Saltykov thought it was time for the Austrians to take their turn against Frederick. He gave the order to retreat. Daun agreed that the next move should be his. Now he felt was the time to take Dresden. Prince Henry had withdrawn a force from that city to go to Frederick's help. He had left only 3,700 men to guard the citadel, but powerful defenses had been raised to stave off attack. The new commander in Dresden, Kurt von Schmettau, was a loyal servant of the king, but when he received word from Frederick himself, after Kunersdorf, that all seemed lost, he gave up hope of successful resistance. An imperial army, 15,000 strong, was approaching Dresden from the west. Daun was actively cannonading the city from the east. On September 4th, Schmettau surrendered. On September 5th, the message reached him from Frederick that he should hold out, that help was on the way. Daun, with 72,000 men, now made Dresden his winter quarters. Frederick came up to nearby Freiberg and wintered there with half that number. The winter of 1759-60 was exceptionally severe. For several weeks, snow covered the ground to the knee. Only the officers found shelter in homes. Frederick's common soldiers lived in makeshift cabins, hugged their fires, laboriously cut and brought wood to feed them, and themselves had scarce any other food than bread. They slept close together for mutual warmth. Disease in both camps took almost as many lives as battle had done. In 16 days, Daun's army lost in this way 4,000 men. On November 19th, Frederick wrote to Voltaire, "If this war continues much longer, Europe will return to the shades of ignorance, and our contemporaries will become like savage beasts." France, though immeasurably richer than Prussia in money and men, was near bankruptcy. Choiseul nevertheless equipped a fleet to invade England, but it was destroyed by the English at Quiberon Bay on November 20th, 1759. Taxes were multiplied with all the ingenuity of governments and financiers. On March 4, 1759, the Marquise de Pompadour had secured the appointment of Etienne de Silhouette as Comptroller General of Finance. He proposed curtailment of pensions, a tax on the estates of nobles, the conversion of their silver into money, and even a tax on the tax-collecting farmers general. The rich complained that they were being reduced to mere shadows of their former selves. Thenceforth, silhouette became the word for a figure reduced to its simplest form. On October 6th, the French treasury suspended payment on its obligations. On November 5th, Louis XV melted his silver to give good example. But when Silhouette suggested that the king should get along without the sums usually allotted him for his gambling and games, Louis agreed with such visible pain that Choiseul vetoed the idea. On November 21st, Silhouette was dismissed. Like almost every Frenchman, the king felt that he had had enough of war. He was ready to hear proposals of peace. Voltaire had sounded out Frederick on the matter in June. Frederick replied on July 2nd, "I love peace quite as much as you could wish, but I want it good, solid, and honorable." And on September 22nd he added again to Voltaire, "For making peace there are two conditions from which I will never depart. First, to make it conjointly with my faithful allies. Second, to make it honorable and glorious." Voltaire transmitted these proud replies, one dated after the debacle at Kunersdorf, to Choiseul, who found in them no handle for negotiation. And faithful ally Pitt, who was busy absorbing French colonies, how could he make peace before he had built the British Empire? 5. The making of the British Empire. The most important phase of the 7 Years' War was not fought in Europe, for there it effected only minor changes in the map of power. It was fought on the Atlantic, in North America, and in India. In those areas, the results of the war were immense and enduring. The first step in the formation of the British Empire had been taken in the 17th century by the passage of naval supremacy from the Dutch to the English. The second was marked by the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which granted England the monopoly of supplying African slaves to the Spanish and English colonies in America. The slaves produced rice, tobacco, and sugar. Part of the sugar was turned into rum. The trade in rum shared in enriching the merchants of England, old and new. The profits of trade financed the expansion of the British fleet. By 1758, England had 156 ships of the line. France had 77. Hence, the third step in building the empire was the reduction of French power on the seas. This process was interrupted by Richelieu's success at Minorca, but it was resumed by the destruction of a French fleet off Lagos, Portugal, on April 13, 1759, and of another in Quiberon Bay. Consequently, the commerce of France with her colonies dropped from 30 million livres in 1755 to 4 million in 1760. Supremacy on the Atlantic having been won, the way was open for the British conquest of French America. This included not only the basin of the St. Lawrence River and the region of the Great Lakes, but also the basin of the Mississippi from the lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. Even the Ohio River Valley was in French hands. French forts dominated Chicago, Detroit, and Pittsburgh, whose change of name from Fort Duquesne symbolized the results of the war. The French possessions blocked the westward expansion of the English colonies in America. Had England not won the 7 Years' War, North America might have been divided into a New England in the east, a New France in the center, and a New Spain in the west. The divisions and conflicts of Europe would have been reproduced in America. The Pacific Benjamin Franklin warned the English colonists that they could never be safe in their possessions, nor free in their growth, unless the French were checked in their American expansion, and George Washington came into history by attempting to take Fort Duquesne. Canada and Louisiana were the two doors to French America, and the nearer to England and France was Canada. Through the St. Lawrence came supplies to England for the habitants, and that door was guarded by the French fort of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island at the mouth of the great river. On June 2, 1758, Louisbourg was besieged by an English flotilla of 42 vessels, bearing 18,000 soldiers under Admiral Edward Boscawen. The fort was defended by 10 ships and 6,200 men. Reinforcements sent from France were intercepted by the British fleet. The garrison fought bravely, but soon its defenses were shattered by British guns. The surrender of the fort on July 26, 1758, began the British conquest of Canada. The process was only slightly retarded by the strategy and heroism of the Marquis de Montcalm. Sent from France in 1756 to command the French regulars in Canada, he advanced from one success to another until, frustrated by corruption and discord in the French-Canadian administration, and by the inability of France to send him aid. In 1756 he captured an English fort at Oswego, giving the French control of Lake Ontario. In 1757 he besieged and took Fort William Henry at the head of Lake George. In 1758, with 3,800 men, he defeated 15,000 British and colonial troops at Ticonderoga. But he met his match when, with 15,000 men, he defended Quebec against the English General James Wolfe, who had only 9,000 soldiers under his command. Wolfe himself led his troops in scaling the heights to the Plains of Abraham. Montcalm was mortally wounded in directing the defense. Wolfe was mortally wounded on the field of Victory, September 12th to 13th, 1759. On September 8, 1760, the French governor of Canada, Vaudreuil-Cavagnal, surrendered, and the great province passed under British control. Turning their ships south, the English attacked the French islands in the Caribbean. Guadeloupe was taken in 1759, Martinique in 1762. All the French possessions in the West Indies, Saint-Domingue excepted, fell to Britain. To add to the profits of victory, Pitt sent squadrons to Africa to capture the French slave-trading stations on the west coast. It was done. The French trade in slaves collapsed. Nantes, its chief port in France, decayed. The price of slaves in the West Indies rose, and British slave merchants made new fortunes in supplying the demand. We should add that the English were not any more inhumane in this imperial process than the Spanish or the French. They were merely more efficient, and it was in England that the anti-slavery movement first took effective form. Meanwhile, British enterprise, naval, military, commercial, was busy absorbing India. The English East India Company had set up strongholds at Madras in 1639, Bombay in 1668, and Calcutta in 1686. French merchants established domination at Pondicherry, south of Madras, in 1683, and at Chandernagore, north of Calcutta, in 1688. All these centers of power expanded as Mughal rule in India declined. Each group used bribery and soldiery to extend its area of influence. Already in the War of the Austrian Succession, from 1740 to 48, France and England had fought each other in India. The Peace of Aix-la-Chapelle had merely interrupted the conflict. The 7 Years' War renewed it. In March 1757, an English fleet under Admiral Charles Watson, aided by troops of the East India Company under a Shropshire lad named Robert Clive, took Chandernagore from the French. On June 23rd, with only 3,200 men, Clive defeated 50,000 Hindus and French at Plassey, 80 miles north of Calcutta, in a battle that assured British mastery in northeast India. In August 1758, an English fleet under Admiral George Pocock drove from Indian waters the French squadron that had been protecting French possessions along the coast. Thereafter, with the British free, the French unable to bring in men and supplies, the triumph of England was only a matter of months. In 1759, the French siege of Madras by the Comte de Lally was frustrated by the arrival of British provisions and reinforcements by sea. The French were decisively defeated at Wandawash on January 22, 1760. Pondicherry surrendered to the British on January 16, 1761. This last French outpost was restored to France in 1763, but everyone understood that French possession continued only by British consent. India and Canada remained until our own time 2 bastions, east and west, of an empire that was built with money, courage, cruelty, and brains, in full accord with the international morals of the 18th century. In tardy retrospect, we now perceive that that empire was a natural product of human nature and material conditions, and that the alternative to it was not the independence of helpless peoples, but a similar empire established by France. In the long run, despite its Clives and Hastingses and Kiplings, the rule of half the world by the British Navy, the comparatively humane and urbane maintenance of order amid ever-threatening chaos, was a blessing rather than a bane to mankind. 6. Exhaustion, 1760 to 62. What was the hunted Prussian fox doing in that harsh winter of 1759 to 60? He was raising and debasing money, conscripting and training men, writing and publishing poetry. In January, a pirate Parisian publisher issued Œuvres du philosophe de Sans-Souci, joyfully printing those reckless poems which Voltaire had carried off with him from Potsdam in 1753, and for which Frederick had him intercepted and detained at Frankfurt am Main. Those poems would amuse uncrowned heads, but would make royal wigs tremble with rage, including those of Frederick's ally George II. Frederick protested that the pirated publication was corrupted by malignant interpolations. He bade his friend the Marquis d'Argent, director of fine arts at the Berlin Academy, to issue at once an authentic edition, carefully purged. It was so done in March, and Frederick could turn back to war. On February 24th, he wrote to Voltaire, "Steel and death have made terrible ravages among us, and the sad thing is that we are not yet at the end of the tragedy. You can easily imagine the result of such cruel shocks upon me. I wrap myself up in stoicism as well as I can. I am old, broken, gray, wrinkled. I am losing my teeth and my gaiety." Vast masses of soldiery were being marshaled to determine which ruler should tax most men. Soltykov, in April, was returning from Russia with 100,000. Laudon had 50,000 Austrians in Silesia against Prince Henry's 34,000. Daun at Dresden with 100,000 hoped to break through Frederick's 40,000, who were now encamped near Meissen. The French, with 125,000, were waiting to advance against Ferdinand's 70,000. Altogether, 375,000 men were being aimed at Berlin. On March 21, 1760, Austria and Russia renewed their alliance with a secret clause giving Prussia to Russia as soon as Silesia should be restored to Austria. Laudon drew first blood of the year 1760, overwhelming 13,000 Prussians at Landeshut on June 23rd. On July 10th, Frederick began to besiege Dresden with heavy artillery, laying most of Germany's then loveliest city in ruins. The bombardment availed him nothing. Hearing that Laudon was approaching Breslau, he abandoned the siege, marched his men 100 miles in 5 days, encountered Laudon's army at Liegnitz on August 15, 1760, inflicted upon it a loss of 10,000 men, and entered Breslau. But on October 9th, an army of Cossacks under Firmer captured Berlin, ransacked its military stores, and exacted a ransom of 2 million thalers, equal to half the British subsidy that Frederick was receiving annually. He marched to relieve his capital. The Russians fled on hearing of his approach, and Frederick turned back to Saxony. On the way, he wrote to Voltaire on October 30th, "You are fortunate in following Candide's advice and limiting yourself to the cultivation of your garden. 'Tis not granted to everyone to do so. The ox must plough the furrow, the nightingale must sing, the dolphin must swim, and I must fight." At Torgau on the Elbe on November 3rd, his 44,000 Prussians met 50,000 Austrians. Frederick sent half his army under Johann von Zieten to detour and attack the enemy in the rear. The maneuver did not succeed, for Zieten was delayed by an enemy detachment on the way. Frederick led his own divisions personally into the fury of the battle. Here, too, 3 horses were shot under him. A shell struck him in the chest, but with spent force. He was knocked unconscious to the ground, but soon recovered. "It is nothing," he said, and returned to the fray. He won a Pyrrhic victory. The Austrians gave way with a loss of 11,260 men, but Frederick left 13,120 Prussians on that field. He retired to Breslau, now his main center of supplies. Daun still held Dresden, waiting patiently for Frederick to die. Winter again gave the survivors rest. The year 1761 was one of diplomacy rather than war. In England, the death of George II, on October 25, 1760, who had cared deeply for Hanover, and the accession of George III, who cared for it much less, gave a royal sanction to popular resentment of a war that was weighing heavily upon English pounds. Choiseul put out feelers from France for a separate peace. Pitt refused, and kept full faith with Frederick. But the British contingent in Hanover was reduced, and Ferdinand had to yield Brunswick and Wolfenbüttel to the French. Choiseul turned to Spain, and in a pacte de famille, a family pact between Bourbon kings, persuaded her to join in the alliance against Prussia. Military developments concurred with these diplomatic reverses to bring Frederick again to the verge of debacle. Laudon, with 72,000 men, effected a junction with 50,000 Russians. They completely severed Frederick from Prussia and laid plans to take and keep Berlin. On September 1st, 1761, the Austrians again took Schweidnitz and its stores. On October 5th, Pitt, overwhelmed by the popular demand for peace, resigned rather than betray Frederick. His successor, the Earl of Bute, thought Frederick's cause hopeless and saw in the negotiation of peace a means of strengthening George III against Parliament. He pleaded with Frederick to admit defeat, at least to the extent of surrendering part of Silesia to Austria. Frederick demurred. Bute refused him any further subsidy. Nearly all Europe, including many Prussians, called upon Frederick to make concessions. His troops had lost any hope of victory. They warned their officers that they would not attack the enemy again, and if attacked, would surrender. As the year 1761 ended, Frederick found himself alone against a dozen foes. He admitted that only a miracle could save him. A miracle saved him. On June 5, 1762, Tsarina Elizaveta, who hated Frederick, died and was succeeded by Peter III, who admired him as the ideal conqueror and king. When Frederick heard the news, he ordered all Russian prisoners to be clad, shod, fed, and freed. On February 23rd, Peter declared the war with Prussia at an end. On May 5th, he signed a treaty of peace drawn up at his request by Frederick himself. On May 22nd, Sweden followed suit. On June 10th, Peter re-entered the war, but as an ally of Prussia. He donned a Prussian uniform and volunteered for service under the king, my master. It was one of the most remarkable overturns in history. It warmed Frederick's heart and restored morale in his army, but he half agreed with his enemies that Peter was crazy. He was alarmed when he heard that Peter proposed to attack Denmark to recover Holstein. Frederick used every effort to dissuade him, but Peter insisted. Finally, Frederick tells us, I had to keep silent and abandon this poor prince to the self-confidence that destroyed him. Bute, now actively hostile to Frederick, asked Peter to let the 20,000 Russians now in the Austrian army continue there. Peter sent a copy of this message to Frederick and ordered the Russian troops to join and serve Frederick. Bute offered Austria a separate peace, promising to support the cession of Prussian territory to Austria. Kaunitz refused. Frederick denounced Bute as a scoundrel. He was pleased to learn that France had ended her subsidies to Austria and that the Turks were attacking the Austrians in Hungary. This in May 1762. On June 28th, Peter was deposed by a coup d'etat that established Catherine II as Empress of all the Russias. On July 6th, Peter was assassinated. Catherine ordered Chernichev, who commanded the Russians under Frederick, to bring them home at once. Frederick was just preparing an attack upon Daun. He asked Chernichev to conceal for 3 days the news of the Tsarina's instructions. Without using these Russian auxiliaries, Frederick defeated Daun at Burkersdorf on July 21st. Chernichev now withdrew his troops, and Russia took no further part in the war. Relieved of danger in the north, the king drove the Austrians before him and recaptured Schweidnitz. On October 29th, Prince Henry, with 24,000 men, defeated 39,000 Austrians and Imperials at Freiberg in Saxony. This was the only major action of the war in which the Prussians were victorious when not under Frederick's command. It was also the last important battle of the 7 Years' War. 7. Peace. All Western Europe was exhausted. Prussia, most of all, where boys of 14 had been conscripted, and farms had been devastated, and merchants had been ruined by the stifling of trade. Austria had more men than money and had lost vital Russian aid. Spain had lost Havana and Manila to the English, and nearly all her navy had been destroyed. France was bankrupt, her colonies were gone, her commerce had almost disappeared from the sea. England needed peace to consolidate her gains. On September 5, 1762, Bute sent the Duke of Bedford to Paris to negotiate a settlement with Choiseul. If France would yield Canada and India, England would restore Guadeloupe and Martinique, and France might keep, with British consent, Frederick's western provinces of Wesel and Gelderland. Pitt announced these proposals with passionate eloquence, but public opinion supported Bute, and on November 5th, England and Portugal signed with France and Spain the Peace of Fontainebleau. France gave up Canada, India, and Minorca. England restored to France and Spain her conquests in the Caribbean. France promised to maintain neutrality between Prussia and Austria and to withdraw her armies from Prussian territory in western Germany. A further Peace of Paris, on February 10, 1763, confirmed these arrangements but left France her fishing rights near Newfoundland and some trading posts in India. Spain ceded Florida to England but received Louisiana from France. Technically, these agreements violated Britain's pledge against a separate peace. Actually, they were a boon to Frederick, for they left him with only two adversaries, Austria and the Reich, and he was now confident that he could hold his own against these disheartened enemies. Maria Theresa resigned herself to peace with her most hated foe. All her major allies had abandoned her, and 100,000 Turks were marching into Hungary. She sent an envoy to Frederick proposing truce. He accepted, and at Hubertusburg, near Leipzig, between February 5th and 15th, 1763, Prussia, Austria, Saxony, and the German princes signed the treaty that ended the 7 Years' War. After all the shedding of blood, ducats, rubles, thalers, kronen, francs, and pounds, the status quo ante bellum was restored on the continent. Frederick kept Silesia and Glatz, Wesel and Gelderland. He evacuated Saxony and promised to support the candidacy of Maria Theresa's son Joseph as King of the Romans and therefore Emperor-to-be. At the final signing, Frederick's aides congratulated him on the happiest day of your life. He replied that the happiest day of his life would be the last one. What were the results of the war? To Austria, the permanent loss of Silesia and a war debt of 100 million écus. The prestige of the Austrian rulers as traditional holders of the imperial title was ended. Frederick dealt with Maria Theresa as ruler of an Austro-Hungarian rather than a Holy Roman Empire. German princes of the empire were now left to their resources and would soon submit to the Prussian hegemony in the Reich. The Habsburg power declined, the Hohenzollern power rose. The road was open for Bismarck. Patriotism and nationalism began to think in terms of Germany instead of each proudly separate state. German literature was stimulated to Sturm und Drang and mounted to Goethe and Schiller. Sweden lost 25,000 men and gained nothing but debts. Russia lost 120,000 men to battle, hardship, and disease, but would soon reproduce them. She had opened a new era in her modern history by marching into the West. The partition of Poland was now inevitable. For France, the result was enormous losses in colonies and commerce and a near bankruptcy that moved her another step toward collapse. For England, the results were greater than even her leaders realized. Control of the seas, control of the colonial world, the establishment of a great empire, the beginning of 182 years of ascendancy in the world. For Prussia, the results were territorial devastation, 13,000 homes in ruins, 100 towns and villages burned to the ground, thousands of families uprooted. 180,000 Prussians, by Frederick's estimate, had died in battle, camp, or captivity. Even more had died through lack of medicine or food. In some districts, only women and old men were left to till the fields. Out of a population of 4,500,000 in 1756, only 4 million remained in 1763. Frederick was now the hero of all Germany, except Saxony. He entered Berlin in triumph after an absence of 6 years. The city, though destitute, with every family in mourning, blazed with illuminations to welcome him and acclaimed him as its savior. The iron spirit of the old warrior was moved. "Long live my dear people," he cried. "Long live my children." He was capable of humility. In his hour of adulation, he did not forget the many mistakes he had made as a general, he the greatest of modern generals excepting Napoleon, and he could still see the thousands of Prussian youths whose bloody deaths had paid for Silesia. He himself had paid. He was now prematurely old at 51. His back was bent, his face and figure lean and drawn, his teeth lost, his hair white on one side of his head, his bowels racked with colic, diarrhea, and hemorrhoids. He remarked that now his proper place was in a home for elderly invalids. He lived 23 years more and tried to redeem his sins with peaceful and orderly government. Politically, the main results of the 7 Years' War were the rise of the British Empire and the emergence of Prussia as a first-class power. Economically, the chief result was an advance toward industrial capitalism. Those gargantuan armies were glorious markets for the mass consumption of mass-produced goods. What client could be more desirable than one that promised to destroy the purchased goods at the earliest opportunity and order more? Morally, the war made for pessimism, cynicism, and moral disorder. Life was cheap, death was imminent, suffering was the order of the day, pillage was permissible, pleasure was to be seized wherever it could for a moment be found. "But for this campaign," said Grimm in Westphalia, 1757, "I should never have conceived how far the horrors of poverty and the injustice of man can be carried." And they had only begun. The suffering helped as well as hindered religion. If a minority was turned to atheism by the stark reality of evil, the majority was moved to piety by the need to believe in the ultimate triumph of the good. A reaction to religion would soon come in France, England, and Germany. Protestantism in Germany was saved from destruction. Probably, if Frederick had lost, Prussia would have experienced, like Bohemia after 1620, a compulsory restoration of Catholic faith and power. The triumph of imagination over reality is one of the humors of history.